welcome Nils McCune.
Good evening. Thanks so very much to the Marin Interfaith Task Force. Everyone still wants to call them the... Is that what it's still called now?
Task Force on the American.
Okay, well, you have all been the Norte. You've been the guiding, orienting, principal chapter of the Bay Area Progressive Movement and International Solidarity for a very long time, and it's a big honor for me to be here with you all tonight. So thank you very much. So the two tasks are the following. One, to form and train a new generation of Latin American leaders in the social struggle in the continent. And two, to convert agroecology into a massive movement which is able to encompass an ever greater part of the landscape of our countries, and in so replace the industrial agriculture movement. And in that sense, reduce the industrial agricultural presence in the global warming problem. So how do we do that? The way that we think we can do that is through rural social movements. Social movements are movements of the masses. They're organizations that have different kinds of ideology, different kinds of identity, different history. They're organizations that people can identify with, whether they be peasant movements, whether they be rural trade unions, whether they be landless worker movements, whether they be indigenous peoples who have organized in the countryside. But they're movements that are not based on a board of directors and a staff. They're based on the historical forces that move many people. So La Via Campesina is a movement of movements. It's an alliance. It's an umbrella that brings together many different kinds of movements around the world. But they're generally movements from the countryside. And many of these movements emerged in different eras in their countries that were in diverse situations. But as a whole, the Via Campesina is sort of like a constellation of different mass organizations. And so the idea is by training the young people of these mass organizations to work in the countryside and work with farmers who are already doing agroecology, so that these farmers can become teachers of other farmers, then we're able to rapidly multiply the agroecological movement. We're able to reach an exponential, we're able to scale up. Because agroecology is a kind of farming or a kind of food production that has to do with incorporating ecological principles into agriculture. But as scientists have discovered agroecology, as it's become a scientific discipline, we've also discovered that we didn't make it up. That in fact, agroecology is based on the accumulation of knowledge that's taken place over centuries and over millennia. And so what we can do as the scientific side is just try to systematize, try to order that knowledge, try to put it in an organized form that people can understand, and then spread it as much as possible. So what we've come to recognize is that peasant knowledge is incredibly important in this. You know? Local knowledge, empirical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes through historical effort, historical process, people organizing together around one idea. And so when we talk about education in this setting, a lot of what we're talking about is recovering knowledge, recovering also historical memory. Since in places like Central America, there's been a destruction of historical memory, right? The same process of repression that we've seen in Central America, of destroying different kinds of revolutionary movements and popular movements, have also tried to crush the memory, the experience, the joy that has gone into creating a popular project. So what we try to do is recover that knowledge, recover that memory, and work with it to create this agroecological movement. So I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about what La Via Campesina is, and then I hope to make this as brief a presentation as possible, because what I'm interested in is the conversation. And I'm here in California for a couple of weeks. I arrived about 2 weeks ago, and The night before last night, and tonight, I'm giving presentations in different cities in the Bay Area, thanks to Marin County Task Force. And I will very soon be going back to Nicaragua, and we'll be returning to the schools that you can see on these pictures, and we'll have the opportunity to give a report back there. So what I really want to be able to talk about is what people have asked, what people are interested in, what kind of solidarity is there in the United States with this kind of work, what are people working on here. So I hope to have as much of a conversation as possible. So to give you guys a little bit of an idea of La Via Campesina, as Colleen said, it's a movement that's present in 79 countries. If we add up the membership of all of the different organizations that are in La Via Campesina, we're talking about 200 million people in the world. So how did this vast movement come about, and what's it fighting for? Well, La Via Campesina was founded in Managua, Nicaragua. In 1990, the Sandinista revolution had been voted out. You know, it's the only case that I know of a revolution that entered power through armed struggle and left power after an election. So they had been voted out, but there was a great number of people who were not old, probably not young anymore, who had been building the Nicaraguan revolution and had never thought that it would disappear. And they were there trying to figure out what to do. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and there was a need to create to acknowledge the fact that this supposed victory of capital was not something that everybody agreed with. It wasn't something that we were all on board for. And at the same time, there was a celebration being planned in Santo Domingo to celebrate 500 years of the discovery of America by Columbus. And all of the heads of state of the Americas, except for Cuba, were going to be present there to celebrate this event. And so the indigenous people of the Americas said, no, we need to organize our own coming together, and what it's going to be about is 500 years of resistance. So in Nicaragua and Managua, when an organization that's called the National Union of Farmers and Ranchers, UNAC, held its anniversary celebration, they invited people from different farmers and peasants movements from all over Latin America. And they talked and they realized that the situation, while not identical in each country, was bastante parecido. It had lots of similarities. There was a lack of an alternative, and there were neoliberal, the Washington Consensus kind of policies being imposed in country after country. And so they said, well, if they're going to globalize capital, we need to globalize our struggle. And so the motto of the Via Campesina became globalize struggle, globalize hope. And the way that it started to organize was by opposing the free trade agreements, which were coming about as a big, exciting next chapter in capital's history, right? And these free trade agreements, often what they meant was that very cheap grain from places like the United States would flood the market of other countries, what's called dumping. And when that happens, then this cheap grain is much cheaper than the production costs for small farmers in these countries. And so they have no market for their grain, they lose their land, and they make up this urbanization, this rapid, violent urbanization that leads to unemployment and the kinds of problems that we see in many countries today. So they said, first, we need to stop this free trade model. The next year after Managua, the Via Campesina was formally organized in a meeting in Mons, Belgium. And a couple of years later, in 1996, there was the first international conference of the Via Campesina in Tlaxcala, Mexico. And at that conference, they created a concept, which has become a concept that's found all over the world today, and it's somehow managed to morph itself and grow and become a concept that is almost universally understood around the world, and that concept is food sovereignty. So in its first moment, food sovereignty meant, just as many peoples had been fighting for national sovereignty for so long, and they had won national sovereignty in so many countries, and the African independence struggles, in many countries, sovereignty was a concept people understood. But capital, through free trade agreements and other things, was undermining sovereignty. So formal sovereignty was existing at one level, but substantial sovereignty, real sovereignty over water, over food, over livelihood, was disappearing. So food sovereignty in its first moment meant each country should produce its own food first. And then, once it's been able to guarantee that it can produce its own food, then it can export food to the world. And that idea as an initial concept of food sovereignty has been evolving ever since then. It's been evolving because not all of us, like we were talking tonight, not all of us feel like when we see the American flag, we say, hey, that's me. Same thing happens in many countries. People identify in a way that's not just as a country, as a sovereign nation. They identify as a sovereign nation, but as a people, as indigenous people, under many flags and under many lifestyles, and under many cultures and ethnic groups. And so food sovereignty has to do with the cultural aspect of producing food. It has to do with the question of power over food systems. Should it be these very, very few transnational corporations that decide how we eat, how much we eat, what we eat, or should it be a combination of the 7 billion consumers in the world and the 1 billion producers in the world? Or should it be these three companies that exist between us? So food sovereignty is really about power. And there's the concept that is the conventional concept around food is called food security, right? And food sovereignty is a radical alternative. Why? Food security says now that every person should have access to an adequate amount of calories that are culturally appropriate each day. So that, on one hand, it's a very atomized vision of society, right? It's the neoliberal idea that each person just exists as an individual. But it is also a definition that turns a blind eye to how food is produced or where it comes from. It doesn't matter, as long as there's enough, and it's not against my religion, I think. Okay? But food sovereignty emphasizes these issues that are so important for farmers about where does the food come from, how do we produce it. So for farmers to produce food, for people who have based their lives on having enough food, the fight for food sovereignty is not just about trade regulations, it's also about access to land. It's about being able to have access to the land that allows them to grow food. It's about defending their territory in the many cases of people who have lost land over the last few years. I don't know if some of you realized or have heard that in the last 5 years, more land has changed hands in the world than in any other comparable time in human history. This is called the Great Global Land Grab. So this reality where land is changing hands, where financial capital is taking over productive resources in the world, is the antithesis of the food sovereignty model, because food sovereignty implies land reform. So let's see, we have fighting for sovereignty against free trade agreements, then land reform within a country, so that people who are producers who have the vocation to produce food for their own country, and not international corporations that are just going to take over the land and produce food to export, or produce tobacco to export, or cotton to export, or agrofuels to export. People who have the real vocation to export need to have access to land. But finally, when they have access to land, do they want to just repeat the model that's been imposed on them of the Green Revolution, of what they call improved seeds, which are not improved seeds, they're just seeds that are able to produce a good ratio between fertilizer and grain. But they're not good seeds, they're not healthy seeds, they're not seeds that can survive drought. So, do we want to just repeat that model when we finally get land? Well, many producers have said, no, what we want to do is recover our way of producing. We want to recover our knowledge, our seeds, our way of using water in just enough, right where we need it. You know, they talk about precision farming being this high-tech solution where the Iowa farmers are on a computer looking at their farm. Well, small farmers have been precision farmers for centuries, right? That's how they work. They work through precision. So small farmers growing food in a diverse way, growing food in a way where they protect their land from climate events, where they're able to cool the soil, where they're able to actually harness more carbon in plant roots and in plant matter than they release through using tractors and fossil fuels. This is the model that we think strongly strengthens our case when we fight for land. It's something that is is necessary. So the Via Campesina has come to see that along with land reform and within this model of food sovereignty, we need another pillar, and that pillar is agroecology. It's the model that we can put out there as a real alternative. So to give you guys an idea, the agribusiness model of food production and distribution in the world currently contributes between 43 and 58% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's, of course, if we combine the production of fertilizers, the transportation of food, the methane produced by manure when livestock is put into close quarters. So all of these things that are problems in the industrial agricultural model can become solutions with agroecology because we have an integration. The management of one part of the farm, what's waste in one area becomes an input to the other area. So there's no need to buy things from the outside. And so agroecology has been shown countless times to be highly superior to the conventional model, to the agribusiness model on farms. But what we need to be able to see is what can we do when we scale it up, when we make it a landscape level, when we make it a global movement. And that started to happen. The Via Campesina is a major force behind that because we have 200 million farmers, 200 million families that we're working with, and because we're present in so many places around the world. How are we doing it? Well, we're combining methodologies. So we have schools of agroecology. The Via Campesina currently has around 60 schools around the world. There's at least 4 schools in Africa, several schools in Asia, in Europe, and in Latin America. And in actually the United States, we had a short course in Florida last year. So we have schools of agroecology, and here on these bulletin boards, on the bulletin board on the right here, there's 4 such schools in Nicaragua that are open and operating, 4 schools of agroecology. And on the left side is the school that we think is going to be especially important, which is IALA Mesoamerica. It's the peasant university of Latin Americans. IALA is the Instituto Agroecológico Latinoamericano, Latin American Agroecological Institute. So the idea is for young people from these various movements, from southern Mexico to Panama, the best, the brightest, the most promising young people from these different movements will be able to study and have a 5-year degree, with agroecology being a central theme of this degree, but also gender equality, also the recovery of historical memory, also cooperativism, also political economy, a great deal of subjects that we think need to be studied theoretically from the peasant movement. But also, the idea is to integrate them not only as students, but within a social fabric that takes place in the countryside, that takes place in the territories of the social movements. So, in Mesoamerica, there's a long history of what's called campesino or campesino, farmer to farmer or peasant to peasant. The idea is popular education in agroecology. Popular education is the Freirean idea that each person can teach another, each person has a lot to offer if they can discover the way to look at the reality in a critical way, to understand their role within a reality that might be highly unjust. So when people are able to harness those critical powers and become teachers, then each farmer can teach another farmer what they're doing on their farm, what kind of agroecology they have going on. We call these exchanges. And by doing so, it's more interesting for a farmer to get to see agroecology than to hear about it in a classroom. It's much more convincing to come from the language of another farmer than it is to come from the language of a technician. We avoid the top-down structure of conventional education, and it's a lot faster in terms of having a territorial impact. So we've found that this really works. In Nicaragua is a great example of campesino, which was, and there's actually a really interesting story of campesino, which it was started in Guatemala during the late 1970s as this method for working with sustainable agriculture. And it really had a huge impact at a local level in one municipality within Guatemala, San Martin. But this was right at the time that the repression in Guatemala became so intense. And so to see all these peasants getting together to talk was a threat to the military government. And many of what are called the promotores, the teachers within their farms were killed. And several of them got out. So depending on where they arrived after they left Guatemala, campesino or campesino took an entirely different form. So many of them arrived in Mexico, and in Mexico there's all these great experiences where local organizations have completely changed landscapes, have reforested, have recovered the soil in Tlaxcala, in Puebla, in Oaxaca, and in Chiapas. In Honduras, they also had very important local effects. But in Nicaragua, they landed in the midst of the Sandinista Revolution. And the Sandinista Revolution was largely influenced by liberation theology, by popular education. So the ideas of Freire, the ideas that each one could teach one, were not foreign to the Nicaraguan experience. So when they arrived, they landed with the UNAC, the National Union of Ranchers and Producers. And the UNAC created a national program, Campesino, which reached at its heyday 30,000 people. Since then it's declined because it's sort of become a pet project of the NGO sector, of the foreign funders in Nicaragua. But in 1997, a Cuban technician from ANAP, which is the Via Campesina affiliate in Cuba, went to Nicaragua, Leonardo Cherin, and he had hoped to go to Honduras also, but he was denied a visa to Honduras, so he had 2 days when they were looking for something to do. He had these 2 days to kill, and so they said, well, look, we'll show you something called Campesino. And at the time, Cuba was on its way out of an acute food crisis, right, which had taken place because of the loss of the Eastern Bloc countries and the tightening of the Cuban embargo, the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And so Cuba was developing an agroecological solution already, but he said, this is the methodology we need, Campesino. He went back to Cuba, and now there's 300,000 agroecological Cuban farmers who have learned about agroecology through this method. So we know it works. We've found that it works, and the Via Campesina has done its own studies, its own process of learning what works best in each country to try to share that among our organizations and develop the best methodology. So our idea is to combine the schools with the processes that take place in people's farms. So that's why we have these 4 schools in the different parts of the country, plus 1 school which will be the more international school, which is the opportunity for young people to come from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Honduras, to get a little break from their reality, which is often very stark, especially in Guatemala and Honduras, where there's a lot of repression taking place against the peasant movement, and to study in Nicaragua. You know, Nicaragua has really interesting characteristics. I see how many people who are here have been in Nicaragua. Okay. It's a country that had a very deep revolution, right? It also had a counter-revolution in the 1990s. But the mass organizations in Nicaragua were able to maintain a little bit of infrastructure. So in our case, the ATC, which is the Rural Workers Association of Nicaragua, which was a founding member of the Via Campesina, but also a strong mass organization within the Sandinista Revolution. This organization still has infrastructure. And so we have these 4 schools, which are ours, and we can operate, and that's an advantage that other Central American countries don't have. Also, Nicaragua is currently the safest country in Central America, because since 2007, the Sandinistas have been back, and there's all sorts of progress in that sense. So it's a safe country to study. So to get young people who have grown up within the peasant movement or within the indigenous movement in their country, who get to come to our school and get to be safe and get to study for a period of time, and not only study in the classroom, but study this campesino movement, the way that it works in the grassroots. The goal is for them to be able to return to their countries with much greater capacities to help their movement get stronger. But the idea isn't to just send them to the front office of their movement because they've studied. No, the idea is that by studying campesino, they have to go into the grassroots. They have to go work these relationships between farmers. They have to become popular educators so that when they are then slowly promoted into the leadership of their movements, they've really accumulated the experience. So that's a little bit of the way that we work. The idea of campesino is that one farmer can teach many others, right? They can come to her farm and she can show them what she's doing, and then they have to try an experiment in their farm. and eventually they can teach others, right? But this methodology requires a lot of follow-up work. There has to be people who can go visit, see how the farms are doing, whether they're doing the experiment in a way that it has a potential for success, how they're going. And that follow-up work, we think we should do it with the young people, who are young cadre who are forming to become the future leadership of these movements, who have had access to political education and who now need to work the base structure of their organizations by facilitating the campesino movement, by making sure that people can make the date that they've scheduled to be there for a farmer exchange, to make sure that it all really happens. So that's sort of the methodology. We have two levels. We have the peasants, the small farmers, the indigenous farmers, who become, we don't teach them how to farm, they know how to farm. We teach them to be teachers of others. And then we work with the young people so that young people can facilitate this movement before they go back and take on leadership roles within the organization. So that's the way we work. We have information about the schools. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming up. The work is going quite well. There's this school, the school in Chontales, which is a picture of us at the new marquee out there on the street. This school is set to begin as soon as possible. We're currently rebuilding it. We're putting a lot of effort into the production system, as you guys can see in these pictures, of making sure that we produce our own food. The goal is to be able to produce our own food within 3 years. That seems like a long way off, but when you arrive somewhere, you have to learn how the soil works. You have to learn what crops work best there. We're not trying to take agribusiness stance where we try to find one crop that we can sell at a high price or export. We're really trying to grow our own food and to do it right so that we can be a model for these young people to go back to their countries. Right now, a lot of our effort is to have enough productive capacity so that we can guarantee food, because food costs are incredible. If someone adds it up for one semester with 90 students and 10 teachers, then we're talking about $60,000 in food costs. So to reduce those food costs, we're putting as much energy as we can into the productive system, buying seeds, buying equipment, and that's sort of where we're at the moment. We're also perfectioning our model of campesino, which has to adjust to each country, right? Cuba is not the same as Nicaragua, but that's where we're at. I want to really put the most emphasis into question and answer. So thank you very, very much. So it looks like before question and answer, this guy's asking for our attention.
Well, you know, this is the talk that somebody has to do. You know, there's some people that you've heard give the fun pitch and they're really good. They crack a joke and everyone's laughing on their way to the wallet. But this is a very serious issue that Nils is raising. First, I want to mention that we've known Nils since he was an undergraduate at the University of Santa Cruz, and we couldn't be prouder of him. Because obviously he could have gotten probably a job in the agribusiness someplace with his knowledge and everything, and had a really rich living. But instead, he decided to work on a project based on collectivity, and so that's very important. And for people coming from this country in this system, where there's so much alienation, to see that is an inspiration, I think. You know, as Nils was talking, it's so clear about what the difference is, because you know we have agribusiness. Agribusiness is the main mode of food production in the world, and there's so much food they don't know what to do with it. They pay people not to grow it. They throw it away. They do everything negative about it, but they can't feed the world. You know, there's still amazing amounts of hunger. And this is a model which is the exact opposite. This is a model, Via Campesina's model in 79 countries. We're looking forward when it's going to be in 179 countries and keep growing, because this is a model, you know, based on grassroots, a grassroots movement for the community, based on the way that people have farmed for years and years and years. So the difference between, there's many differences between agribusiness and the Campesina model. They are, of course, financed based on profit, financed by banks and corporations. This movement is based on people like you, because without contributions, and Nils is here on an educational tour, obviously, and he just gave this great talk, but he's also here as a fundraiser. And so this project, especially the one that he works on, the Rural Workers Alliance Association, this money that you will give us tonight, that money goes directly to these people and their tools and their hoses and their vehicles and their buckets and all those little things that are needed that adds up in cost. So I really hope you can look at it as like you are really, any money you give tonight will really go directly to this project. The funding from this, the Rural Workers Project is not funded by the Nicaraguan government. It's got no big NGO money, no corporate money. A lot of the Via Campesina money came from, some of it came from Europe and especially in the Basque Country. And that money, of course, was based on the euro, which when the euro came into existence, remember, it was 2.5 euros to $1. Well, now it's almost 1 to 1. And so you can see how a project like this has taken a tremendous hit. So really, we really ask you to dig as deep as you can, and so that, when he goes back, he can tell people how generous people were in the United States and how, especially for us, the progressive movement that is hit up for money all the time. But we ask you to do it one more time, and like I say, it's really going to go to a good cause. So thanks a lot. Do we have, Colleen, do we have the buckets here? That's a good sign. If a person gets even 2 claps, that's all you got. Oh, and one other thing is you should look at these. Everyone should take these. If you're in a position to become a sustainer, that would be the best, because they can predict the amount of money that they would get. So please consider that. Who the checks are made out to?
The checks can be either made out to IALA, I-A-L-A, or to AFGJ, which is the Alliance for Global Justice, our fiscal sponsor. That also means that the checks of, I think, over $200 are tax deductible. I might be making that up, but I know that it is tax deductible.
Yeah, it's tax deductible. Yeah. It's a 501c3 for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Still know what it is. So I'll take questions.
Can you repeat the
Sure. These also mention who checks can be made out to. It can either be AFGJ, Alliance for Global Justice, or IALA, YALA. So AFGJ is fine. AFGJ. Thanks you very much. So questions? Yes.
I have 2 questions. One is just sort of about your personal journey, like how you got to where you are. And the other is to the extent to which the Campesino movement is flying under the radar of the government and what you're thinking about protecting, whether people need protection or...
Sure. Okay, thanks. So as Colleen mentioned, I grew up in the Bay Area between Napa and Oakland, and I studied in UC Santa Cruz, and I'm 1 generation removed from the farm. My dad was born on a farm, but in Missouri, but then came to the city. At UC Santa Cruz, I was expecting to study sociology. I arrived at the university 3 days after September 11th, 2001. And in my first semester, I took a class that was called Agroecology, and I thought, well, hell, this is what we do after the revolution. This is what we did. And then as time's gone by, I realized that this is actually, it's a revolutionary praxis. This is the way that we can build something in our daily reality. And it's not just looking at all these big giant problems and hoping for a solution and then what would we do. This is actually something we can do right now and it transforms. So I got out of the university. As you guys can understand, I was in the university during the Bush years. So I got to learn a little bit about student activism, anti-war work. And then after that, I worked as a union carpenter for a couple of years. And then I had the opportunity to take a scholarship and study in Cuba. So I studied agroecology and sustainable agriculture, got a master's degree in Cuba at the Central University of Las Villas. Cuba also has a program of free medical school for people who are interested in the United States. There's opportunities to study for free in Cuba. So that was a great opportunity for me to get a master's there and to work with Cuban farmers and to see how agroecology had become the way that Cubans eat, and the way that Cubans farm, and that they had recovered so much knowledge, and they had they were creating a model that we needed all over the world. And so I was deeply moved by that experience, and then after that I went to work in Mexico. I worked with an NGO in Mexico and with the Autonomous University of Chiapas. And so that was good for me to learn a lot more about how campesino agriculture really works, because Mexico is a radically different experience than Cuba in terms of state support and in terms of ecological conditions, many things. So I learned a lot more about the technical side of agriculture in Mexico. And at the same time, I started working with the Via Campesina as a voluntary translator. And so I got to see, at a meeting in Mexico City, there were 14 languages and people from all over the world talking about the economic basis of food sovereignty, what that might mean. And I got to see the leadership role that women play in Via Campesina, the leadership role that youth play. I got to see all these things that maybe I'd been looking for. And so after that, I tried to figure out how to be on board full time. And at the same time as I was able to enter into a Mexican university on a scholarship, which provides me with a salary, I was connected and sort of sent to Nicaragua to work on this project 2 years ago. So for the last 2 years, I've been working full-time with the Via Campesina with my academic studies making up the salary. And in the second question was about whether the peasant movement is under the radar in many of these countries, and for that reason maybe it hasn't attracted the attention of the government, or whether there's cases where campesinos are in danger, right? It's kind of... Well, actually the Via Campesina has toppled some governments, not by itself, but with many other social movements. So a founder of the Via Campesina is Marin and Evo Morales. He's one of the founders, and we have there's some old pictures of him with my bosses. It's pretty cool. The Via Campesina is definitely related to the resurgence of the left in Latin America. You know, it's in a place like Nicaragua, where there's been this horrible period, the neoliberal period, 16 years of brutal Washington consensus, the total formula, which included 4 structural adjustment programs. From 1990 to 2006, the Human Development Index of Nicaragua fell 62 places. So Nicaraguans have really been through it. You know, there was a law that was supposedly for school autonomy. What that meant was each school was autonomous to fund itself. So essentially it was school privatization. And many other such things that have created an enormous sector of urban unemployed and underemployed, which has no real hope. So the Via Campesina, by promoting an alternative and by working outside of the political system, but often also putting pressure on the political system, has been able to change that. So in Nicaragua since 2007, the country that was importing 70% of its rice in 2007 and growing 30% of its rice. That 2 years ago, by the time I arrived in Nicaragua, it was inverse. So it was growing 70% of its rice and only importing 30%. And now it's even more. Now it's about 85% that it grows. So there's certain major changes like that. We've also won 4 major laws in Nicaragua that were either written by or partly written by or supported by the Via Campesina. So one is a law of food sovereignty, which was passed in 2009. Another is a law to foment agroecological production, which was just passed in 2013. Another is a cooperatives law that helps us organize. And another is a law to create a fund for women to have access to land. So it's not land reform, it's creating a fund to buy land to give to women. So those laws have been pushed by the Via Campesina, and we want to see each of them enacted as they should be. They're sort of in process, they go slow, you have to be patient. We're hoping for a deepening of some of the processes that are starting to take place in Nicaragua, but we don't expect it right away because it's really a national reconciliation government. At the same time, there's other places where the Via Campesina is enemy of the state. So in places like Honduras, Rafael Alegría, a compañero of ours, has been under threat of death many, many times. Daniel Pascual in Guatemala also. And in those two countries especially, there's been many, many, many deaths of people who are members of organizations that are part of the Via Campesina. Margarita Murillo, there's an endless list, right, in Aguan Valley, in Honduras. So there's a very significant repression in many of these countries. Also in, of course, Colombia is a classic example of campesina repression, and in Paraguay. So we actually had a university. Ayala, this isn't the only Ayala in the world. No, there's several Ayalas in Latin America and South America that are in the process of being built. There's one in Marin, Venezuela, another that's coming soon in Colombia, another that's coming soon in Chile, that's only for women, another in Argentina that is also in the process of being built, and another in Paraguay that was fairly advanced until the coup d'etat in Paraguay, and since then they've been pushed off of them. So it's kind of comes and goes, there's a flow to it, but in Nicaragua we have more favorable conditions for a lot of these things, and that's why with the question of what we call formación or education, political education, Nicaragua is a key place because if people are safe, because we have a progressive government, and because we can focus on things like studying up. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit more about land and how important that is in the process, and some of the other things that you talked about last night with regards to peasants getting back control of their land, especially the example that you gave in Africa?
Yeah. So there was a question last night about what are like the key components for making agroecology feasible. And I think the first answer would be access to land. People need to have land. People who have the vocation to produce for their own people or for anyone, they need to produce food. They have it. Like in Chiapas, people will say, no, I'm not planting any corn this year, but the first rains come and their hands start to twitch and they have to find seed because they have to plant. They have this vocation to grow food. And so that happens all over the world. And people who have been denied land access don't have the possibility of doing agroecology. So when we fight for agroecology, when we fight for a model that can, maybe consist in another century of life for humanity, maybe consist in a great, wonderful future for humanity, because we get out of the climate crisis, we get out of all of these existential crises that capitalism has led us into. When we propose this other model, this agroecological model, we have to fight for land access. And I think what Michelle's helping to mention is a story that's very interesting. The headquarters of the Via Campesina, I should explain that the Via Campesina at its very top has a woman named Elizabeth, who I suggest no one get into a fight with. She's a Zimbabwean woman who is brilliant and tough, and really what she does is she's the chairperson of an 18-member council, which is called the International Coordinating Council. And the International Coordinating Council is made up of 2 people from each of the 9 regions of the Via Campesina in the world. And each region has 1 woman and 1 man who represent their region before this council. When the Via Campesina was founded, they decided that in any decision-making space, men and women needed to be equally represented. So for the last 20 years, it's been a model for gender equality in the world. This 18-member council meets twice a year, and every 4 years there's a conference of the Via Campesina. So for 8 years, the headquarters of the Via Campesina was in Indonesia, and they were trying to decide where to move the headquarters to. And the Zimbabweans came up and said, we'd like to tell you how agroecology has come to Zimbabwe. Now, I know many of you have probably heard of Robert Mugabe, probably have an idea of Zimbabwe, or have heard of, what's the lion? Cecil, the lion? We know a little bit, right? So, you know that the independence struggle in Zimbabwe was fought by peasants. It was a peasant struggle, and that means that agrarian reform was a central issue of the struggle. And when the the government, the revolutionary government first took power, its major issue was going to be agrarian reform. But Great Britain told Zimbabwe, if you touch white farmers' land, Rhodesian colonial farmers, if you touch their land, we will invade you. If you don't, we will create a $100 million fund to help you buy land and redistribute it. So the Zimbabwean government said, okay, war, $100 million, we'll take the $100 million and we'll redistribute land in this peaceful way. The money never came. And so as the decades wore on, the popularity of the Revolutionary Party started to wane. So by 2000, the West had produced a party out of the British and US embassies to beat Mugabe, and he was maybe headed for defeat. And so in the midst of this presidential campaign, this interesting coalition was formed that included war veterans, indigenous leaders from many of the different tribes across the country, and traditional healers. So the shamans, the people who, the ones who understand healing, formed a coalition, and overnight took a huge part of the country of Zimbabwe. They organized themselves practically in a military fashion. And I love hearing the story from the Zimbabwean farmers of what it was like for these white farmers in that next morning, waking up and walking out onto their porch, and there's 7 different families there. And then saying, get out from my land. And the families are looking back up at them and saying, whose land? You know, what do you think you are? What do you think the real name of this tree over here is? People who, you know, it's a colonial farming model, right? Sort of like what took the United States. So this moment, right, the farmer turns back and calls the cops and says, I got 7 families on my farm, come down here. And the police say, you know what, we've had 150 of the same calls this morning. This is a political matter. So in practically overnight, it really took about a week and a half. Most of the land of the country was occupied by poor people who had been denied land and who had fought for independence based on access to land. And so Robert Mugabe, who was in the middle of a political campaign, had to decide very quickly what to do. And he decided to create a fast-track land reform program. And so Zimbabwe started to redistribute land. And about that time, Western sanctions arrived, right? Soon afterwards. And so it's really interesting because the initial hardcore, those who had really organized this movement to take the land of the country, had always had a vision that was the Zimbabwean vision of agroecology, which would be no foreign fertilizer in our land, no foreign seeds in our land. We're going to be using our own seeds. We're going to be making our own fertilizer. We're going to be wildcrafting the medicines that we've always used. And we're going to be reconstructing our indigenous knowledge. And so, with the sanctions, their philosophy was suddenly the only way you could go because there were no longer any imported items in the stores in Zimbabwe. The stores were emptied. The money could be used for starting fires. So with the inflation, with all of the economic, what's the word in English? With all of when you force somebody's arm, right? This effort to try to crush the Zimbabwean will, their model became stronger. So now they've gotten rid of the sanctions and here's Zimbabwe on its feet. And it's very interesting because it's sort of like, in some ways, you know, it's the country. It is the country that has had the greatest reform of land access. It's redistributed more land than any other in the 21st century. So for African countries, Zimbabwe is a little bit like Cuba was last century, where it was the Cuban land reform was the profound land reform that other countries in the continent looked to, as this is how we could create a different model. Well, Zimbabwe has done a similar thing. So when they got done telling the story, everybody said, no, headquarters is in Zimbabwe now. So they also have an agroecological school that I know some of the professors of, and it's a really interesting school. They have a slightly different model because they say, well, if we bring one farmer into our school, they can stay a month. They can be convinced of agroecology, but when they go back and they talk, the rest of their family will think they're lying, will think they're crazy, they're not going to buy it, so we'll bring the whole family. So the entire family comes and stays in their school for a month, practices agroecology, and then goes back. So it's a different model, it's really interesting. But you know, in December of 2013, ANAP of Cuba, the originators of this massive campesino structure that now is feeding Cuba, invited peoples of the world to their encuentro, which they have every 2 years. There's another one coming up in December of this year. And after the encounter, after the meeting, they had a special course for the teams who work on Via Campesina agroecology schools from all over the world. So we got to have this encounter with people from Europe, from people from Africa, from people from South Asia, from South America, all together sharing methodologies about how we can teach agroecology. It's a really wonderful event. So that was where I got to hear a lot of these stories.
I suppose that GMOs are trying to go into Nicaragua as well. And if they are, how are you dealing with that? And also, your fertilizers are, I suppose that they're fully organic, right?
Yeah. Well, the first question was about GMOs. The Via Campesina has a very strong position on GMOs, on transgenics. They're completely opposed to them. And not just from some sort of an abstract ethical idea, but because they really haven't shown to be at all useful. There's really only 2 major GMO technologies in the world that have ever made a profit. The one is what's called Roundup Ready, which has led massive amounts of glyphosate to be dumped from airplanes all over the world, and has led to super weeds and all kinds of, glyphosate has now been proven to be a carcinogen. So that's a tough situation for Monsanto, which has spent the last 60 years selling it. It's going to be like the tobacco lawsuits, right? Just a generation of lawsuits. So what Monsanto, which is the world's largest seed producer, is going to do is they're in an effort right now to buy Syngenta, the second largest seed producer of the world, whose headquarters are conveniently in Switzerland. So if it's able to buy Syngenta, it can move its headquarters to Switzerland and change its name, and there's no more glyphosate lawsuits. So this Roundup Ready is the one technology that has been highly successful. The other is BT. So BT cotton, BT soy. BT is a natural insecticide. But what they do is they splice it into the plant's DNA in such a way that every tissue of this plant is insecticide. So in the same way nature adapts very quickly, there's also now super pests who are able to adapt, and then there's the chance of this BT, this insecticide, starting to grow in different kinds of weeds. That's also taking place. So anyway, we have a very strong position in the Via Campesina against GM crops. In Nicaragua, there's an effort, of course, like in all countries, to start to sell GM seeds, to say that they're necessary. There was a visiting professor in the Agrarian University from the United States who was this sweet guy who never said much of anything, and the day before he left the country, he published a scathing op-ed in the national newspaper saying that Nicaraguans were fools if they closed the doors to GM crops. So there's an insidious effort, no? There's one detail that we haven't said about Nicaragua, which is interesting, which is that who really runs the country is Daniel Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, and she's one of the examples of a very important leader in Latin America who's almost unknown outside of her country. She is personally strongly opposed to GM crops, which makes them unlikely to come up in the future. But, there's a law that is likely to be passed in the next year, a seed law in Nicaragua, and there's many different versions of what that law could be like. And, of course, we expect GM crops to continue to be prohibited, but there's all kinds of loopholes that could occur for experimental scale, which can be up to 20,000 hectares. So there's all sorts of ways that they could insidiously jump in. The second question was about fertilizers, whether we use pure organic or completely organic fertilizers. There's not really like a litmus test that we do like that. We look at agroecology as a process. The idea is agroecology is based on principles. It's not a recipe, it's not one size fits all. They're ecological principles, and they're ecological principles that are then passed through all these cultural filters. So they're different everywhere, and we try not to have something where we can say this is not good or this is good. We try to look at anything that's a step forward as something useful. We have our own, in our school, we make our own fertilizers. Most of the time, we like them, they're good, we can get better, but it's also about how these different farmers in their different area make their own fertilizers and how they can figure it out and how they can share whatever recipe they've come up with. But the idea is not to have the school be about what's the newest, best compost that we can show off. It's really about how do we create a social process for agroecology reaching another scale. Does that make sense?
Are you using chemicals in the fertilizer?
No, we're not using any chemicals in our production system. What we still do is for like the baby piglets that are born, we do vaccinate them and we clean their umbilical cord with iodine and stuff like that. So there are some chemicals that we have on the farm, but not any kind of herbicide or pesticide or conventional fertilizer. Yeah.
And, the encuentro in December, where will that be?
Huira de Melena in Artemisa.
In Nicaragua?
No, in Cuba.
Oh, Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's your, I have some familiarity with UNA, what's your relationship with UNA? And then second part is what's your relationship with the MST in Brazil?
Mm-hmm. I'll start with the first part. The MST are brothers and sisters. They're the ATC is dear friends with the MST. Many of our people study in Brazil. Sometimes they come and visit us from Brazil. They've stolen some of our greatest cadre. We love each other and we work together all the time. The MST is the landless workers movement of Brazil, which has developed this fascinating method of raising consciousness in people by working with very poor people who have worked in the countryside their whole lives and often have never imagined a different reality than just picking cotton or cutting through cane. And so they work occupying land, they educate, they organize people, and from the most basic need, which is land access, they're able to create a process where people become politicized and start to see their obstacles, understand their obstacles ever more clearly, and fight not only for land, but for a national project in Brazil. And when you hang out with people from the MST, when you spend time in the encampments of the MST, the sense is, this is the future of Brazil. This is where things are going. Right? There's also two Ialas in Brazil that I didn't mention. I failed to mention. One is just like Cuba has the Latin American School of Medicine, Brazil has the Latin American School of Agroecology. And another is called Iala Amazonas, which is more in the Amazon region. So UNAG is a more difficult question because UNAG is the National Union of Farmers and Ranchers in Nicaragua. When the Sandinista Revolution triumphed, the ATC had been a clandestine organization that had been working within plantations, organizing workers based on liberation theology, and had created committees across the country of poor workers. As land reform started to take hold, as the country started to enact land reform, the Sandinista Front decided to divide the ATC into two parts. One would continue to struggle for wages and working conditions, and the other would be for people who had received land. So the UNAC was formed in 1981. And at that time it started to grow as the land reform grew. But it also started to incorporate people who had had land before the revolution. So the idea was, as the Sandinista Front started to identify a contra movement, the UNAC would be there to try to win things for farmers who might otherwise join the contra. Remember that the CIA was heavily influencing the Nicaragua countryside, was showing up with leaflets, was doing radio broadcasts, and was really pushing to create a contra movement. So the UNAC played a role where it was a loyal opposition. It would demand things of the government during the 1980s. And the ATC, which was still farm workers, landless workers, played a different role, which was to defend the revolution. So the ATC put more people in uniform than any other mass organization in Nicaragua. And so in 1990, when the Frente Sandinista was defeated, the classic difference that they tell me is that the UNAG dedicated itself more towards, okay, how do we do business now? and the ATC dedicated itself to trying to defend the social gains of the revolution. So there's just a slight class difference that can be noted. At the same time, though, UNAC has this massive base of peasants in the countryside, and it's a wonderful base, and they have had this campesina movement, so they really have a lot of material to work with. But although it was at their meeting that the Via Campesina was founded, a couple of years later, they left the Via Campesina and are now working in a coalition of big farmer, big ranch organizations. It's international in scope, but much more to the right in political spectrum. So the UNAC still has some potential, but they're mostly focused on big deals. They work on exports to Taiwan and stuff like that, and less on peasant movement stuff. Yeah, but they're both part of they both support the Frente Sandinismo all the time. Good.
You mentioned the potential of the Via Campesina for dealing with climate change.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure you know, several national economies in Latin America are heavily dependent on resource extraction and export, especially petroleum. So could you say more about how that dynamic might play out and what the potential is for the organization for displacing that emphasis on and skewing of economies towards resources?
Yeah. So we're talking about the neo-extractivist model, which is there's this global land grab that we talked about. There's also a resource grab. It's also about mining interests, about petroleum interests, natural gas interests. And we can see it happening with, for example, the Canadian mining companies. Who knew that Canada would turn out to be a villain in Latin American history in such a way? This land grab is very intense, and the resource grab around it is also very intense. So for countries where the left has won elections, but hasn't taken power, there's a difference, right, between having a government and taking power. One thing is to win a government, and there's been how many different kinds of assassination attempts against Evo Morales, against Rafael Correa, Hugo Chavez. So where they've won elections, the idea has been to create good work as quickly as possible, to show that another world is possible. And what they've had as possibilities is to use the same model that they inherited, which is the resource extraction model. And so Chavez's emblem of let's sembrar petróleo is let's plant our petroleum. So we have this petroleum money, let's invest it in our society, in the kind of society we want. And so that's been the model, and it's very difficult to get out of that model right away because we still live in a capitalist world, and how else can you show that one model is better than the other besides spending money? Where's the money going to come from except for the petroleum that's in the ground? So it's difficult to get out of that resource extraction model. But what we think is that we don't need to make agriculture about extraction, right? Extractive agriculture, that's agribusiness. We exploit the soil until it's exhausted. We exploit the water, the groundwater, until there is none. We exploit human beings to make a profit. So we think that we can create a better system in agriculture. We don't have to wait. We can do it now. Agroecology is that model, and so we're doing it. And there's an article back here that's called "Small Scale Family Farmers Are Cooling the Planet," which I encourage you to check out. It's a report that was done as a team between Via Campesina and an NGO, which is called GRAIN. And it shows just how much the corporate agribusiness model contributes to climate change, and just how much the agroecological model can arrest climate change, can actually reverse climate change. So we do think that small farmers are cooling the planet. We know that that's not the only piece of a solution, but we also understand that, since since Reagan era, since Thatcher era, and since the TINA, there is no alternative. Since the 90s, we've been really in a tough spot. And so to try to come up with a global solution really requires looking for as many local solutions as we can find everywhere and combining them making a patchwork and total solidarity between peoples, and absolute solidarity as much as we can, to try to see our own struggle and the struggle of others, and to try to understand our own contradictions and the contradictions of others. So this process of getting past the extractive economy is a complex process. I wish it were a lot easier, but the world doesn't have outside funding. We have to do it what we have. That's as much as I got to say.
Is there a place for hydroponics and aeroponics what you guys are doing? And especially considering vertical growing systems, for instance, okay, and the issues with land.
Sure, yeah, there's space for all of that. You know, I think I want to try to put it out there as technologically, it's a big camp. It's a big tent. There's not one technology that we think is inherently superior to another. In general, hydroponics take a lot of energy, right? Require a lot of fossil fuel burn, require a lot of energy. There's cases where they require less. You know, there's all kinds of interesting stuff that we do, not at our university yet, that we'd like to do, but the Agrarian University of Nicaragua has, for example, which have to do with combining fish and crops. So you have fish growing in one tank, and with their excrement, you're able to fertilize your crops, and because the fish are moving around, they oxidate the water. There's all this interesting stuff you can do. And I'm for it, it's great, you know, and I think I speak for most of the people who are working in our university when we say that stuff is really interesting and we really like it. Doesn't mean we always have the money to put into a system like that. Most of the time we don't. So most of the time what we're working with are the traditional technologies that peasants have brought to the area, and so we might work off of that model to try to find little ways to improve the efficiency of nitrogen intake, to improve soil organic matter. But it doesn't mean that we don't like those technologies. We think they're cool, and we practice them in different ways. And when people come, if you want to come to the school and show something, give a course, it'd be awesome. That kind of thing's really well.
Nils, can you talk a little bit about the school that you guys are building right now and what you're hoping to make of it and what
Sure.
the current conditions are and what you're trying to do?
Sure. So on the two boards, there's one that's in the midst of this green and white board and between the two doors, so it's hard to see. And then on this board that's to the left, those are all pictures from the school that is in Chontales, Nicaragua, which is to the east of Managua. And the way that school works is it is a 90-acre farm. It's a beautiful farm, which has a river. There's a river that runs through the farm. And there's facilities for growing different kinds of livestock, like birds of all kinds, chickens, maybe geese, hens. There's facilities for goats and sheep. There's facilities for pigs and for cattle. So there's a lot we can do there. It needs a lot of love. The place has got it's got a good infrastructure that we can improve on. And right now we're there, but we haven't had a semester yet. And before we have a semester, we want to be growing some food because we think that it's just too expensive to throw that much money into buying food when we can grow it there. So for now, the idea is to see how much we can produce in the rest of the year there. The kind of stuff that Bill was talking about, buckets, it's incredible. I took $300 back with me last time I was in the States, and those $300 were like, I couldn't figure out how to spend it all. It was just, there was bags to buy, there was rope to buy, there was cable, there was all kinds of things that people were asking for because there's a group of people who are on the farm who are working there each day. They're all volunteers, by the way, and so they've been there, they live off, they eat and they work, and they've been asking for different things. And finally, with the last $80 or something, I said, well, you know, like, why doesn't this go as an extra? Because people had to dig down the bottom of the well. The well wasn't deep enough, and it had completely dried up, so everyone was bathing in the river, which really, there wasn't much of a river at that point. There was just some puddles, and people were walking a kilometer to bring water to drink in wheelbarrows. So at that point, you know, the well had run dry, so these guys got into the bottom of the well and broke the bottom of the well, which is rock, and broke down another meter to be able to access water. So it's hard work out there. We're still kind of in that phase where everything's really hard. But but the last $80 we just put it into people having a really well-paid day of work to be able to get to the water.